Hi, folks. This is Don Moynihan. I am professor of public policy at the University of Michigan. I'm also past president of APPAM, and I am going to be your host for today's discussion. People are still joining, so we're going to sort of start slowly and gradually here. Um, I will introduce our panelists in just a second, but as people are coming in, let me also advertise another forthcoming webinar that APAM will be sponsoring. Okay, so here it is. So one of the concerns that people who are interested in doing research is about what's going to happen to data and access to data at the federal government level. And obviously, one of the things that the federal government does in a way that no other entity does is to collect and distribute data about the state of the world. Um, what's going to happen to that data in the future? We're not sure, but we're going to talk about it here at APAM on March 4th from 2 to 3:30. We have four excellent experts on this topic. So if you're interested in today's discussion, please also consider registering for that upcoming webinar. It's free, open to everyone. We would love to have your participation. But let me get back to today's discussion. So as I said, I'm Don Moynihan. I am past president of APAM. It's a pleasure to see so many of you here today. We have uh, room, I think, for a very engaging conversation. We have three experts who are going to join me. Nick Bednar, who is a professor and expert in administrative law at the University of Minnesota. Don Kettl, who's professor emeritus at the University of Maryland. And Loren DeJonge Schulman, who now works with Telos Labs, but until relatively recently was working with the Office of Management and Budget, and prior to that, the Partnership for Public Service. So each of them has a unique and specific expertise that we're going to tap into today. Before we do, let me just sort of open with some remarks here. This is an unusual moment, and I think we just need to acknowledge we're in a space and time that none of us have seen before in terms of what I consider to be an attack on federal programs as well as federal employees. And so it's very difficult for us to draw from prior examples in the past and say this is exactly like this moment. The scale and speed of some of the changes that are occurring are to some degree overwhelming, and it makes it difficult to feel any sense of stability in the moment. So some of the questions you might want to ask, I'm not sure that we're going to have the answers to, or at least I'm not sure we're going to have satisfying answers to. Nonetheless, we do think it's important to provide space for discussion and community at this time. And so I'm going to ask an opening question to each of our panelists, and we might riff a little bit amongst each other, but we're mostly going to leave space open for questions. And so, as Leslie just noted in the chat, if you have questions, post them in the chat. I'm going to try to collate those questions, bring them back to our panelists to facilitate discussion. Again, really important, I think, to have room for discussion and Q&A. So let me start with Don Kettl here. So Don, you're an expert on civil service systems. You've studied public administration your entire career. You care about the working of government. Uh, what do you think the effects of the new administration in its first month in office will be on public administration and the public administrators who are in that system, so the civil servants themselves? Um, and what is the thing you expect to see next that we haven't seen in the headlines yet? That's a very broad question, Don, so you have room to work with.
Yeah, plenty of room to get myself in trouble here for sure. And the first point, just to underline, Don, what you started out by saying is that this is unlike anything that this country has ever seen before. We've had a more dramatic set of changes in a shorter period of time than ever before. People compared it a bit to the Roosevelt administration, FDR in his first 100 days, but this rivals that or surpasses it, especially because it's trying to do all that stuff upside down. And so we're looking at that as the kind of foundation, and we're also looking at what amounts to a repudiation of the merit system principles that have guided the operation of government for, by my last count, 142 years. And in the period of about that many days, just turned it all upside down, and in some cases, turned it all off. The idea of creating a system based on merit and harnessing that merit in the interest of the government and of the people with an idea toward neutral competence, basic principles of the field are things that have just been tossed out the window. I will tell you, I was expecting big change, and I was expecting that they would do a lot through executive orders and other kinds of administrative tools. But I told everybody before Christmas, I just hope for an extra strong set of seatbelts from Santa, but I wasn't remotely prepared for what's happened. This is stunning and historic. And the question about how it is that we're going to set up a government with the capacity to do what the people want to do is something that is a stunningly important problem. And so we start off by trying to ask ourselves, what are the principles that ought to guide both our thinking and maybe even the government's thinking as it moves forward? So in terms of the answer to the first question, Don, this is a really big deal. And it cuts right to the core of public administration and public management, because the question of developing competence to do what it is that government is charged with doing is something that's fundamentally been tossed out the door. And so the idea has been fundamentally to just find a way to drive a bulldozer through as much of government as possible, as quickly as possible. The idea of creating competence of any kind to accomplish government's task is something that is fundamental at the core. So what is it's going to happen next that we haven't thought about? And given the fact I've already established that I hadn't really thought about what it is that's already happened, I'm a little nervous about going out on the limb on that one. But a couple things. The set of guidance that came out yesterday from the Office of Personnel Management and the Office of Management Budgets, very interesting. It talks about taking the bulldozer for the first 40 days or so and putting it into high gear all in the next 2 weeks by finding strategies of eliminating even more federal employees and eliminating as many programs as possible. That's stunning. So we're going to see, if you like the first 40 days, you're going to see more and more and more of that. But then there's the phase 2 part of that order, which calls for a much more fundamentally strategic vision on what it is that agencies ought to do and how. This is, in some ways, I surely don't agree with a lot of what's in there, but on the other hand, I do give them credit for saying, let's think strategically, let's think about how to try to organize what government ought to do, and think about how many government employees we need to do it, and to think about how it is that those decisions are going to affect ordinary Americans. That's sort of not a bad list of things to go through, but the problem is that first, they want to have all that done by the middle of April. And I don't know any organization on the planet capable of doing that. But then on top of that, they are talking about doing the planning second and the acting first. And so how you can devise any kind of a sensible strategy on trying to reorganize the government and to reduce the number of federal employees, assuming that's what you want to do, is something that I just can't conceive of. So that what's going to happen for sure is the quintessential cart before the horse problem. That is, cut first, plan second, and then down the line is what's going to happen to services and which services are going to be hit. I can't really predict which one, but I do predict that there's going to be some kind of major public service problem and crisis that develops, whether it's a repeat of the baby formula crisis that we saw back 3 years ago, or whether it's going to be more problems with air traffic control. I mean, who knows? But there's going to be something that the public is really going to complain about it. It might even come with the difficulty of filing tax returns and then getting refunds. So big problem is going to start bubbling up. And then the last thing And I'll leave this to the economic modelers in the group, but we need an over-under on how long Elon Musk is going to last, and whether or not he's there as a useful instrument for Trump and outlives his usefulness and then gets tossed out, or whether or not he's clever enough to continue to find ways of exerting his influence over the executive branch, and therefore is in a position to have even more dramatic change going forward. But the we're asking questions that are far beyond the realm of anything that we even might have imagined on January 19th, I think.
And I just want to echo something that my fellow Don just noted, which is there are some things I think people who have been paying very close attention to the plans of the Trump campaign could see coming. And so, for example, we focused a lot on Schedule F and the politicization of the public sector workforce. And we still haven't seen that fully play out yet. But there were also a whole bunch of things that we did not see coming and where we may have underestimated the scale. So I would include in that the scale of the attempt to downsize government, the use of things like administrative leave to remove employees from their workspace, the degree to which Musk has really been given extraordinary and I would argue unprecedented control over workforce personnel issues in the federal government. Um, One thing I'm just going to pin for now, Bill Gormley asks in the chat about how do we frame these debates to people who are undecided, maybe not consuming news closely. And I think we'll have a chance to come back to that, Bill, but I wanted to pick up on Don's point about the rifts, so the reductions in force that are starting to be announced. And if they are of the scale that are being discussed, so numbers like 50% of Social Security staff, then we're talking about really dramatic changes in terms of the ability of the government to simply hold up field offices and see people who are Social Security clients. Nick, let me move on to you here. So one of the questions that we are pondering, and I'm sure you have been asked a lot, is this legal? And that could be about a specific action or it could be about a whole bunch of things. But one of the traits of the Trump administration so far is to push the boundaries of what we thought the law was, to invite lawsuits and hope to win in court. And so, from the perspective of someone who studies administrative law, where are we on this? What can we expect to see in the future? What are the sort of tactics that Trump is using to push the boundaries of the law here?
Yeah, so let me begin by saying the following, just as a caveat to everything I'm about to say. What is lawful does not always make good policy. So if I say something's lawful, it's not a tacit endorsement of what the administration has done. It is simply a recognition, mostly that the guardrails have failed. So to the main question, is any of this lawful? Let me give the best lawyerly answer I can, and that's it depends. So some of the actions that the administrations have taken are clearly within the authority of the president, or the president has a colorable argument that he has the lawful authority to take those actions. Other actions are clearly unlawful under the Civil Service Reform Act. So one of the most important determinants, and I think the reason you're seeing the president push the boundaries, is what does the Constitution allow the president to do? So there is a theory called unitary executive theory, which is a theory of Article 2 of the Constitution. And unitary executive theory says that the president, in order to faithfully execute the law, needs to have complete control over subordinates within the executive branch. And from that, the president has derived this right to remove officers. And so there are kind of some variations of that, and the Supreme Court has affirmed some version of that argument in a few recent cases. So a couple years ago, the Supreme Court said that the president had the ability to remove the director of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. And we're seeing Trump push that argument further. His executive orders are clearly colored in constitutional rhetoric, and they're advancing in the litigation this argument that the president has the authority to remove whatever subordinates he wants. How far the court takes that argument is an open question. So I think it's likely the Trump administration will win some of these arguments with respect to higher level officials. There's at least one judge on the Fifth Circuit who has requested that they review it with respect to the entire civil service. And so if we take this argument and extend it to the civil service, the entire system we have to hire and retain civil servants through tenure processes is unconstitutional. So everything else I'm about to say wouldn't matter at all. So then the question is, well, is the president currently complying with the Civil Service Reform Act? And it's a mixed bag. So, let's start with the legal. The president clearly has the authority to execute a hiring freeze, which he has done. The courts have upheld the right of the president to withdraw outstanding job offers, which he has done. And so we might disagree that those are good policies, but he has the discretion under the Civil Service Reform Act to actually do those. So then let's talk about the illegal, or at least one example of the illegal. So the firing of all the probationary employees without giving them due process. So probationary employees, they're new hires in the federal government. They're typically on probationary status for 1 year, and they enjoy fewer due process rights by virtue of their status. And so the Trump administration sent out mass emails, or agencies within the Trump administration sent out mass emails saying, hey, you're not performing at the level we expect, and therefore we're going to remove you from office. And that performance language is really important because these probationary employees do not have a right to appeal the removal if they're removed for performance-based issues. Now, the problem with this is that many of these probationary employees are actually some of the best performing employees in government because they are trying to demonstrate that, hey, I am qualified to do this job, and I want the tenure protections that come after that year. So the Office of Special Counsel yesterday won a stay before the Merit Systems Protection Board, asserting that many of these probationary employees had been unlawfully removed because the way to perform a mass termination in the federal government is to use reduction in force procedures. Those procedures cover probationary employees, and because they weren't used, they were unlawfully fired. But then there's a bunch of stuff that's really questionable. Stuff where the president is making a very strategic argument that I don't necessarily buy, but I understand why a court might adopt that argument. So take Schedule F. The president has authority under the Civil Service Reform Act to reclassify employees in the competitive service to the accepted service. And they've done this really crafty statutory interpretation argument where they've taken this phrase, confidential policy determining policy-making positions, and said that's now part of the accepted service. And that group of positions under the Civil Service Reform Act doesn't enjoy due process, and so they can be fired at will. Now, where Schedule F becomes more questionable is with its implementation. So we've seen from documents obtained from the Office of Management and Budget, they've extended Schedule F to things like executive assistants, IT specialists, scientists. And so they're taking a really broad understanding of what policy-making position means. That interpretation currently doesn't comport with a set of regulations that were issued during the Biden administration, but it's very clear the Trump administration both intends to repeal those regulations and say those regulations aren't actually lawful in the first instance. So let me just close by saying the following, which is it's a mixed bag as to how lawful some of this is. To some degree, like from a practical matter, it's not clear to me how much it matters. The courts move very, very slowly in order to restore the rights of these individuals. It could take years, and many of these individuals need to move on and find new jobs. And so we're at this position where the guardrails that protect administrative capacity are starting to fail because they can't move fast enough in this current moment.
Thanks so much, Nick. And a couple of points I would bring up there is judges have choices about if they want to issue emergency or temporary injunctions, or if they direct employees back to internal processes within the federal government, like going through the Merit Systems Protection Board. And so, one of the things we should be watching for, I think, is the sense of urgency that judges are bringing to the table in their decisions. Do they say, we think the balance of harm is so potentially great here that we're going to stop the federal government from acting? Or do we give the benefit of the doubt to the federal government, allow them to move forward, and then employees can simply go through the traditional court system or internal review systems in order to try to make their cases? And I think those choices have a really large effect then on the outcome. The other thing I would say is eventually when we do get one or more big decisions on unitary executive, this is going to matter a lot to the potential rebuilding of the public sector down the line. When and if that day will come, we will see. But imagine if Congress eventually decides we're going to write a new civil service law that makes explicit certain things are illegal and certain things are not. If the Supreme Court takes a very aggressive unitary executive authority, they won't really have the ability to do that. And absent that, then future employees are not going to have a rules-based or legal framework that cannot be politicized. Any new president can come in, exercise enormous discretion, which means that you can never really promise to a federal employee things will be fine 4 years from now or 8 years from now. And so the credibility of the promise of stable employment or non-politicized employment simply cannot be maintained any longer. Let me turn to Loren. So, Loren, you have been looking at the outside when you were working with the Partnership for Public Service and then working on performance issues in government as part of the Office of Management and Budget. So I'd like your thoughts on what's going to happen to the capacity of government to achieve its basic goals, to achieve the goals that are set out for programs, for the quality of services that are delivered to clients of the federal government. What do you think the outcome is going to be here?
That's a great question, Don. Thank you for having me here. And thank you very much to Nick and other Don for offering not only today, but just overall, all three of you have been incredible resources and partners over the past few weeks and also over the past few years too. So I want to talk about this. I could talk about this for a while, but I'll try to break it up into two big chunks. One in terms of hard capacity, like real humans, real systems every day who are working on behalf of the American people. And then the other in terms of soft capacity, more in the emotional and employee experience realm. And I can build on a few things that Nick said well, because I think that one of the greatest harms that has come in terms of overall capacity has been the emphasis on probationary employees, and also the use of administrative leave, particularly for SES. And on probationary employees, I think an additional way to think about how he described this is that probationary employees are, just think about all the areas where the federal government has, in the last few years, made a really concerted effort to either improve or to fill in longstanding gaps in their capacity or to address new challenges. Those are areas where, slowly as they often do, they have been hiring considerably. And those are the employees that are probationary, and they've been hit the hardest by many of the cuts and will likely continue to be hit the hardest by the cuts that we've seen. Every agency, so what does that mean in terms of like what does that profile look like? Every agency has worked hard over the past few years to onboard what we call customer experience talent. So whether that be at Department of Homeland Security or the State Department or Social Security or otherwise, people are helping organize what it means to serve the American people in terms of field offices or digital capacity or customer service desks or anything else like that. A lot of that is now gone. More specifically, you see that in places like the IRS, the VA in terms of their PACT Act capacity, the State Department in terms of their passports capacity, areas where the Biden administration in particular, but past administrations too, had said, we need to do better, we need more people, we need to better serve the American people more quickly, and onboarded a lot of new individuals, both at like a frontline level, but also at a strategist level to help do that better. There's also the category, I would say, where federal government has recognized that, okay, in the long term, we're going to have a major risk in a particular area. We need to start bringing on talent now so that we're more capable in that area. So artificial intelligence was a big one that I worked on, but there's lots of other categories, whether that be pandemics at NIH and the CDC, the bird flu capacity that you see at USDA, FEMA bringing on different sorts of disaster resilience specialists to deal with new sorts of challenges related to climate change. These are, again, these are areas where we've hired a lot of people in the last several years. And again, they are hit the hardest by those probationary areas. You also see probationary employees in places where you have a very high turnover rate, like frontline field offices. So like a Social Security field office is a great example of that. They have higher turnover, as well as healthcare. For a while, nurses and folks who worked in healthcare in VA, military, and IHS had some of the highest turnover in the federal government. Those probationary employees are, again, they're going to be hit hard by this. So what we are basically guaranteeing by targeting these employees first is that Americans will feel that impact, if not immediately, then quite soon. When they need to have or they want to seek services from government, it's either going to be slower, more inaccessible, not possible to do at all, or fraught with errors in some way. And I confess I was quite surprised that they took this approach, because to me, it's like it's going to be unavoidable that it will be noticed. And it's longer term, I think there will be frustrations around like, well, you know, these are areas where like AI, disaster resilience, and pandemics, these are areas where government is uniquely and often solely equipped to deal with those challenges. Why is it we have diminished capacity at the CDC, USDA, and other places where there's not an alternative? I don't have another place to turn to. The other area that was very striking to me in terms of capacity is they are clearly taking steps to both politicize and decrease the number of senior executive service, but they've also put a number of them on administrative leave. And I think what has been notable to me about that is those are often individuals who are best placed to enforce accountability and oversight, to raise questions about legality, to raise questions about effectiveness. So by removing that layer, whether purposefully or not, we lack eyes. We lack people who can raise a hand. We can let people who can raise an alarm and say, I don't think this is going to work out as you think. So even for the folks that they've not permanently let go, but placed on administrative leave. The second category I wanted to talk about is more in the soft capacity. And this is going to be more for many of you to measure as we get better climate survey data and many other things. But it is hard to describe. Like Don, you started going about this, like this break in the compact between the administrative state and civil servants, and how they can trust what their day-to-day will be like, what their mission will be like, what their service will be like. That's going to result in not only just tremendous stress, but also just a day-to-day questioning of whether or not it is possible to execute the mission that they came in to serve. So public service motivation and how it impacts not only our ability to recruit individuals into the civil service, but their ability to actually do their jobs day to day is very much at the top of my mind in terms of worry. And I think that will also trickle into organizations that receive grants, that seek out contracts and other partnerships with the federal government, because it's not as though the federal government makes it easy for them to do so. So if you are making it even more challenging, their willingness to participate in such endeavors and their tolerance for what government throws at them will almost certainly go down. On the addition to the day-to-day, I think that the impact the impact on civil servants in terms of their trust in leadership to follow through, to do the right thing, the trust that the data systems that they have access to are accurate, that they won't go away, that they haven't been corrupted, and just the day-to-day challenge in their attention of like being able to focus on what their mission is, all of that is going to have a significant impact on their capacity and probably their willingness to stay. I think that to the broader point that Don was making before too, and then I'll close out, this breaking of the compact between like what it meant to be a civil servant with the merit system protections and so on, that so much of what that is underwrites what I consider to be the core civil service roles, in that your ability to speak truth, to do hard analysis, to make hard recommendations that people don't like. By ripping out the rug underneath many of those, the assumed protections that you have, you're going to lose access to that. So we won't just have a very stressed out, very busy, very smaller civil service, but we'll have one that is significantly weaker in their capacity to actually do the work that we want them to do. With that, on that very happy note, I will turn it back to you, Don, to continue the conversation.
Well, let me ask a quick follow-up question, and I'm reminded of the great scholar Christopher Hood, who passed away this year, and wrote about public service bargains, the sort of psychological contracts that federal employees or public employees generally had with the government, and how much those depended upon norms, and once those norms are violated, it is hard to make them credible again. One of the things you mentioned are the effects on public employees. I have a very specific question on this. Every year, the Office of Personnel Management collects survey data from federal employees through the Federal Employee Viewpoint Survey. And Partnership for Public Service uses this to sort of aggregate, say, where are places where morale and job satisfaction is high and low. That's obviously a place where we will be looking to see if these changes are having an effect on morale. But my question to you, Loren, is do you think they'll still collect this data in the future?
I'm skeptical for a number of reasons, one of which is some of the teams that not necessarily do this day to day, but are relevant to that are some of the teams that have been riffed at OPM or have been cut at OPM. I'm hopeful that they will. And interestingly, while you saw a lot of variability in the FEV scores during the Trump administration previously, I don't think people assumed it would be nearly as, it did not go down or have as much variation as people thought. So it may be that they are wanting to use that as a proof point in some way. They may also use it and then not publicize it in the way that they often do and only share with a couple of key points there. I do think that there are great risks in terms of the anonymity of that data, because so much of it is tied to OPM's ability to protect those email addresses, protect the linkage between the recipient and the responses they have, and then also have concerns about whether or not we would be able to trust the results that we saw overall. But if they did do it, I think that we would see a lot of interesting results in the category, as I mentioned, around trust, around public service orientation, around commitment to go the extra mile, and so on. You often see, and then I'll close out, during prior administrations, some of the agencies that underwent the biggest shifts were those that had the biggest turmoil in terms of policy priorities. Department of Education and EPA, because they would go from one administration where they were center of attention, and then another administration where they were effectively trying to break them up. I think you would see similar shifts across the rest of the federal government in this case, as you often see it at an EPA.
Yeah, and then certainly the backdrop where federal employees are feeling concerned about the security of their data and information and the degree to which they're being surveilled are not the ideal conditions under which you would want a survey to occur. And especially right now, the Office of Personnel Management feels like a shell of its former self. Effectively, it's been captured by DOJ. Let me ask Nick a question which sort of combines two comments that came up in the chat. One points out that some probationary officers are not new. They're switching from one position in the federal government to another, but they might have been in the federal government for 10 or 20 years. Are they any better protected? And also, what about Musk? Like the legality of Musk, he is a special government employee. He is merely an advisor to the president. He is not the official leader of DOGE. It all of this raises a bunch of questions about accountability and legality of whether Musk is, do we think of him as a principal officer? Do you have any insight on his role in particular?
Yeah, so let me take those two questions in sequence. So on the probationary employees point, no, this is a very important point that you can be probationary, but not have not be a new hire, right? So individuals are often placed, not always, but often placed in probationary status when they receive a promotion that makes them supervisory. So I am going to be honest, I don't wholly know how the RIF procedures apply to those individuals. Here is what I have been, in part just because like we're in like an unprecedented world where it's a little difficult to tease out everything that happened. Here is the best guess I have based on talking to some individuals about how this should work. Um, those probationary employees are only probationary with respect to their supervisory status, not with respect to their entire career. And so they still are afforded tenure with respect to positions they've previously held, but not their supervisory provision. And so they should technically, if the RIF is properly performed, which, like, to be clear, very skeptical that's going to happen because they're hard to perform if you're trying to do it well anyway, those individuals should be cut later. That said, that's not legal advice. I don't wholly know how it's going to shake out. Okay, so the Musk question. Yeah, the Musk question's very interesting and perhaps one of the biggest debates on the administrative law professor listserv right now. And I don't have a great sense of it, just because I'm not like an expert in like the appointments clause, but my impression is as following. So the reason this debate has emerged at all is that the president has to appoint principal officers with the advice and consent of the Senate. And it's very clear Musk is not, you know, appointed with the advice and consent of the Senate. He's a special government employee who's been hired to perform a temporary task. Special government employees, the reason we have that category is mostly to bring in experts, a lot of times academics, who have some specialized knowledge about a program the government is trying to develop or implement. So there's this question as to whether Musk is exercising such a degree of executive power that he would be classified as a principal officer. Some people have analogized Musk to the White House chief of staff. He is the mouthpiece for the president and he's telling agencies what to do, but he himself is not actually exercising executive power. Other people think he is actively exercising executive power because he's sending all these emails, creating new policies. There's currently a case pending on this issue, sort of. It's like a little weird because the case was filed with the idea that Musk was DOGE's administrator, and then the Department of Justice attorneys for like a week kept saying, we don't know who the DOGE administrator is, and now we have a DOGE administrator. I believe it's Amy Gleason, but it's not clear like when she became DOGE administrator, how involved Musk actually is with DOGE. So I think we need more information to really understand what Musk is and what he has to be.
Um, so I mentioned earlier, Bill Gormley had asked a question, which is in the chat, about like how do you explain to undecideds about the value and importance of work that federal bureaucrats do. And one thing I'm going to just sort of suggest is an answer to that is that a lot of folks who are in APPAM work on policy implementation and outcomes. And so now is a great moment to use that expertise to explain here's how services work, and here's what we know about what happens if they experience shocks like budget cuts. And so, for example, there is work, for example, by Deshpande and Lee on what happens when you close Social Security offices, and it reduces the quality of service, leads to more crowded offices, fewer people get benefits that they're eligible for, and especially affects people with disabilities, lower income, and lower education. So there are some places where we actually do have evidence here about what's going to happen, and it's going to be especially difficult to square that evidence with some of what is in the RIF memo, the reduction in force memo, which tells agencies that they are supposed to maintain a certain level of quality when it comes to service delivery. And so that is a potential point of conflict there, a place where I think APPAM members can play a particular role. Another question was about how we're coping. I would just encourage people to add their answers to the chat in that. I don't think any of the panelists have a particular expertise on insight about that. And so I think we're all sort of doing this differently. One question, and maybe I'll direct this to you, Don, which is that we're seeing, is this an evolution in the administrative state? Do we need new frameworks to describe and characterize American public administration at this moment? Because the old frameworks that we're used to simply don't work any longer.
That's a great question, and a couple of things, a couple of points should enrage just about everybody here. I've told my colleague Don and Nick in the past that I'm a raging moderate, which means that I'm sure to make everybody unhappy at one point or another. And my take on this is that were we looking at the election of a Democrat as president, we would not be having this conversation, and we would have seen a situation where the administration would have been circling its wagons around the status quo without really making any real change at all. And that is something that clearly the voters have decided they're not thrilled about. And so defending the status quo is a non-starter. If we wanted to go back to the reality of January 19th, at this point, we could not. We just simply could not go back because of, if nothing else, all of the upset and the turmoil that's been stirred up. And so that we're in the middle of a situation where, like it or not, we're in the middle of a radical change. This is not evolutionary by any stretch of the imagination. This is a fundamental radical shift in the role of administrators and the role of the administrative state in American society, in terms of its size, in terms of its scope, in terms of its expertise, in terms of its power, and in terms of the way in which it connects to ordinary Americans. I will say that this is a conversation we would not have had Kamala Harris been elected president, because simply the Democrats were not prepared to talk about this. But on the other hand, what we're doing now, I think, is profoundly unwise in lots of ways. But on the other hand, what it does do and is to open up conversations like Don's question, which is what is it that, in fact, a new administrative state ought to look like? My view on this, for what it's worth, is that we could not go back. If we could go back, we shouldn't go back, because we were in the midst of fundamental changes anyway, and fundamental challenges and problems with the administrative state. That we're at the point where you can sense with the guidance that came out yesterday, a recognition that both Trump and Musk can't get behind the bulldozer and just push it at high speed to everything, because at some point they'll run out of things to flatten, either because they'll just run out of ideas, or because all the agencies that they want to cut will have been cut, or there will have been so much pushback that they'll decide they can't go any further. And so at that point, then the question is going to be, well, now what do we do? And one of the things that seems to be clear is that the Democrats don't really have a plan. It's not clear that Musk has one either, except well, let's see what happens when we slash everything down. But we do have fundamentals that we have to try to reckon with. The idea of hierarchy as the fundamental guidance and structure of government organizations is something that is not going to evaporate, but which is not going to be nearly as important as it was once. The idea of thinking about competence as something that is pigeonholed inside individual people and individual places, inside individual agencies, inside of individual descriptions of positions is something that's obsolete, because the really effective work that gets done in government happens across boundaries. And so we need to train people to do that, but we also need to recognize that that's an important part of the way in which administration ought to operate. We have a new era inevitably for information technology and for AI. If you're interested in trying to figure out how to eliminate the hundreds of billions of dollars of improper payments in Medicare and Medicaid, it's not a matter of finding people who are over the age of 100 or receiving benefits who shouldn't. It's a matter of using smart AI to be able to identify the patterns that shouldn't be there. And that's something that we could and should use. It's a way of trying to use IT and information to replace authority as a kind of basic sinew inside government agencies. And most fundamentally, it's a way to try to reorganize government thinking so that it focuses much more on the results for individual Americans in terms of how it affects them in their daily lived lives. And so a government that thinks about capacity in those kinds of ways is, I think, where we need to go. But the question is whether or not this is where the Trump administration will take us. We would not have had this conversation, I think, with a Harris administration. The Trump administration has set us up for the possibility of having it. And now the question is whether or not they will let victory slip through their fingers and leave us with an even bigger problem to solve. But it's pretty clear that if we could go back, we couldn't at this point because it's just not going to be possible. But if we could go back, we wouldn't and shouldn't, because we need to think ahead about how it is we ought to rethink the role of the administrative state.
And just picking up on a couple of the points Don is making here, I think there is great interest and probably bipartisan interest in things like personnel reform, but maybe more on the hiring side than on the firing side, and on things like procurement and the use of technology. And to some degree, DOGE had this window of opportunity where they actually could have gotten a lot of people from both sides of the aisle quite interested in the project of modernizing government. And I think at this point, there's very little of that goodwill left. And so that I feel like is a missed opportunity. And for those of us who've been studying American civil service systems in the context of American history, I think we've been looking beyond the US for examples and models. And so when I gave the presidential address at APPAM last November, I talked about personalist systems of government and comparisons like Hungary as a benchmark for understanding what is happening now. A couple of other questions. So Amanda asked about RDRC, so the Social Security's research units funded at universities on research about social security recipients, including the disabled. Those have been cut. I have not seen much publicity about those, Amanda, and I don't know what their legal status is. Another question that Mohammed asks about higher education is what are the tools that the Trump administration can use to pursue higher education? I think we've seen one or two of those already. So there's been a Dear Colleague letter sent to universities about how they understand DEI and how they expect universities to follow policies related to DEI. And also, there's a very large financial cudgel that the federal government operates in terms of the huge flow of funds that go from the federal government to universities, and even something like changing the overhead rate for NIH awards could have a dramatic effect on universities. But let me see if anyone on the panel wants to jump on that question of higher education.
Let me make even more enemies if I could start off by trying to respond. We have to look carefully at the world outside our universities and recognize that there's probably never been a time in American history where universities were held in such low esteem and where experts were not recognized as the kind of people who ought to drive society. There was once upon a time, and this is something for you to all take back to your faculty meetings, in Chinese government about 1,000 years ago, the professors were held in such high esteem that they were carried around from meeting to meeting in sedan chairs. Would we could return to those days where the level of respect was that high. But now the problem is that the professors are viewed as being elite and therefore out of touch, by being woke and therefore not being in connection with really in contact with American society, that they're overpaid, and we all know the reality of that, but that's the perception, that that students are not being taught the things that they need to learn to be successful in the world. And these are all gross generalizations, but they do characterize the way in which higher education is perceived in the outside world. And you can see that in the way in which state universities in particular are struggling with their relationships with state governments, especially in red states like Texas, where I am here now, where it's a constant ongoing battle with the legislature coming down harder and harder on all of these questions. And so part of it is, if this is an existential question about the administrative state, it's also in some ways an existential question about the role of universities and about what it is that we ought to do, about what it is that we ought to teach, about how it is that we think about the work that we do and the research that we conduct. And it also has to do with understanding and talking about our relationship with the rest of American society in fundamental ways. And so, and then take that and up the ante even more. It's existential, I think, for our schools of public affairs and public policy and public administration. Because first, we all know that there is a demographic problem coming down the line. And so there's simply going to be fewer students who are going to be able to enroll in our programs because there's just going to be fewer students. Those students have already been born, so we know what the pipeline is going to look like. What is it that we ought to tell them about the value added for the education that they get from us in comparison to, for example, going to law school or going to business school? What is it that we can give them that's different, that would help them cope in this world? And I think there are some good answers to that, but in many ways it may not be all what it is that they're being taught now, because there's things, for example, the sorts of things that Nick's talking about. I wonder in how many schools of public policy would you learn these things? And if you don't learn them, then to what degree are you going to be capable of being able to negotiate the realities out there, or to be able to have impact on them? And so if you're going to have impact, then you have to understand, for example, some of the things that Nick is talking about. If you specialize in just particular narrow policy areas, then the question is, what's the comparative advantage of a school of public policy as compared to lots of other places where you could get training? So I know this will infuriate lots of people, but I think we have to see this question as existential for us in the university as it is for the administrative state.
If I can just add really quick to Don's point about how many times would you, or like how often would you learn in a public administration program, the legal side of a lot of this, right? It actually goes the reverse for lawyers, right? So one of the things that civil servants complain to me about a lot is you lawyers don't actually understand what we're doing. You understand your little Administrative Procedure Act, and that's all great and fine, but like you don't understand process, whatever. Like you don't understand why we make policy. You don't understand what it is the government does or the realities of doing it. You're like wedded to these like archaic rules from the 1940s. And that is very true. So it goes both ways, right? And so I've started offering a class on policymaking and public administration for lawyers. That's just like basic intro 101, like here's a crash course in public policy, in public administration, so that if you are going to go work for the government, you can talk with the people who you are representing. We'll see if, they continue to let me teach that class, but, so I think it goes both ways. It's not just that, public administration people need to learn law. It's that legal people need to learn public administration too.
And I think policy schools are in many ways wrestling with some of these things. Certainly, I've been spending a lot more time talking to administrative law people in the last 6 months than I ever imagined possible, and thinking about how to teach my classes differently. There's also, to Don's point, this sense of how much representation should we have of different viewpoints about government, and whether it's possible to maintain within the domain of policy schools a set of viewpoints that feels, I think, to many people working in public policy, just inherently destructive and deeply skeptical of public service as a starting point. And where the debate about having good faith ideological differences ends versus where is there simply a massive commitment to hollowing out government and whether we feature that in our policy school settings. Um, Let me ask a couple of questions, and maybe Loren and Nick might have thoughts on this. But this is from Jennifer Fold and Henry Batchofer. So one is about the breadth of the OPM RIF memos. So given the scale of the rifts that are being discussed, is it possible to actually have a true assessment of staffing needs for an agency in the time frame discussed? Also, Henry asks, does the APA play a role here? And actually, Don, you may also want to weigh in on the first question too. But let me start on the legal question, and Loren, do you want to jump in first?
Yeah. Let me want to take a step back really quickly that relates to all the questions you all have been just walking through, in that within policy schools and within the debates that we're having, we are often debating administrative state as is, and we are forgetting a very important component of the ecosystem here, and that is citizens, in thinking through what is it that they want of government, and are they getting that? Are they getting that value? And not thinking of it as what do they want from government as is, but what do they want from government writ large? And as much as I am deeply skeptical, frustrated, and scared about this present moment, I do see it as an interesting opportunity to reframe that conversation, because Donald Trump is nothing but, in many cases, a people pleaser. He likes to say yes to people. So when you are able to make the case of here's what citizens want of their government in certain ways, he's often persuaded by that. Some of the greatest public customer experience innovations and investments we've seen in the last several administrations took place under the last Trump administration. And there's some interesting experiments going on in this in California, their Engage CA and other things like that, to bring more people's perspective in, not just what is your feedback on service as is, but what do you want broadly out of this huge institution that we're investing in? On the question of the RIFs, I saw the deadlines and I laughed hysterically because they are it. So to answer the question up front, no, it is not possible to genuinely do the sort of analysis they're asking for in the time frame allowed. But that has been a fundamental challenge with every executive order and memo they've come out. Their timelines have been preposterous. I hope, and I have to assume, that behind the scenes, agencies have been working through some of the homework here, knowing that this was coming. I don't want to say that I was happy about the RIF memo, because that's not true, but I did appreciate that it set out principles of what it is we're trying to do here. And it included very specifically you cannot go about this unless you can guarantee it will have certify, very important word, positive impacts on services to the American people at the IRS and Social Security. I would actually love to hear Nick's view on that word certify, actually anyone's view on the word certify, because we have performance data that will make it challenging for them to lie about that, frankly. So I think they're not going to be able to do good analysis, but the fact that they're asking the question and applying principles to it is a positive thing and a very good opening for congressional oversight and the GAO to engage on.
I think Loren just hit it out of the park there, which is the certify part of this is important, not because I think they're going to necessarily do a good job of what they are doing, but because it provides this opportunity for Congress and the GAO to request these certifications and really evaluate what's going on. And that will increase some of the amount of transparency that is happening. And we haven't had that transparency for a lot of actions. Now, I agree wholeheartedly. Like, it's laughable, the idea that you could plan a RIF this large, this quickly. I've seen the Department of Housing and Urban Development's proposed RIF, and it doesn't pass snuff under the current procedures. It's 2 pages long. Like, the RIF procedures are inordinately complex. You have to like put together retention registries that evaluate what positions individuals could go into if they are removed from their current position. You have to specify exactly which possessions you're getting rid of and why you are getting rid of them. It's not simple to just say, "Oh, we're getting rid of everything in the in housing and urban development." That's not a RIF. I mean, they called it a RIF, but that's something procedurally obscure. The Administrative Procedure Act, I don't think plays a huge role in this, but the same standards are incorporated in the Civil Service Reform Act. So, like, agencies can't take actions that are arbitrary and capricious with respect to personnel actions. That is the same standard that governs in the Administrative Procedure Act. Courts kind of do a very similar analysis, but are pretty deferential to agencies as to their explanations for why they're engaging in a RIF. Despite that deference, I don't know whether they. Let me put it this way. I'm confident some agencies will successfully perform a RIF. I am not confident that every agency is going to perform a RIF, particularly if we're looking at entire cabinet departments and just saying we're cutting everyone who's above GS 13 or below. I don't remember which way it said, but regardless, the point stands either way.
And can I step in on one part of this somewhat arcane discussion about RIFs and firings and that sort of thing? One of I've pretty much given up on the war on this, but the language that's been tossed around about RIFs and firings and layoffs and leaves and all the rest of the stuff there's just stuff floating around out there, which are terms loosely borrowed from the private sector, which don't apply to the way in which government operates. And strictly speaking, except for people at the top of the chain, who are mostly political appointees, individual federal employees can't be fired. You cannot use a reduction in force to try to engage in punitive action against people whose performance is substandard. On the other hand, you can't use a blanket statement about poor performance to put everybody on a paid leave so you can get rid of them. We have a buyout that wasn't really a buyout. There's all these terms that are being thrown around that we have, I think, as a group of scholars in the field, the responsibility to try to help people sort out. And if you're interested at some point, it's fascinating to look at just the chain that the administration has used to get to where we are now. There was, on the evening of January 20th, a 2.5-page set of instructions that came from the Office of Personnel Management that first talked about probationary employees and then explained this creation of paid leaves of absence. And it said that essentially, if you were working in an organization that was being eliminated or slated for fundamental restructuring, then you could be put on a paid leave. So you weren't fired, you're being put on a paid leave. And then from being on a paid leave, the argument was that people could then be fired as a result of that. But the federal government can't fire people in that way. And that's part of the way in which the legal cases are running out. Then the probationary employees who were just summarily dismissed on grounds of performance, given the fact that some of them had no performance evaluations done, others had not even started working yet, and therefore couldn't be fired on the basis of performance because there's no performance in which to evaluate them. So they're running into legal problems with that. And then there's the question now of what to do about a reduction of force, which it turns out is extraordinarily complex because there are pre-existing arrangements with some of the unions and agreements there that have to be followed. And at the same time, there are lots of bumping rules that come into place. So you just can't simply have a reduction in force that eliminates an entire agency or part of an agency without going through all these bumping requirements. And so the administration in general and Musk in particular has been throwing around language that was sloppy to begin with and which doesn't apply to the government, but which has to do with what it is that not only is possible to do, but also in terms of figuring out how you create a rule of law around all this stuff. Extraordinarily important to sort out, and that's why I'm so glad that we have Nick to be able to enhance our conversation here about these things, because we as people in the policy business need to, at least, if not understand all the details, at least know that somebody does, and we need to point people in direction where people can help sort all this out.
So one question Jacqueline raises is about the use of AI on personnel decisions. So we have seen reporting, we don't know if it's true, that the emails responses that Elon Musk is requesting from employees, the 5 bullet points that sum up their activities, is intended to be fed into an AI that will help prioritize which employees are to be retained or not. Um, this, to me, if you know anything about AI, the idea of having a massive government-wide application of an untested tool just feels like a recipe for disaster. And usually, if you're building some sort of large language model, you want to do it very carefully with lots of pilot testing before you bring it to scale. And so there's a degree to which this feels like just engaging in a massive experiment on public employees with something that hasn't been proven in the private sector or really anywhere else. So that is my rant about that. But Jacqueline's question was actually, are there any lawsuits about this? Would the use of AI violate personnel laws as a mode of performance review? And again, does anyone have insight or a view on that, Nick?
I know of the lawsuit. Yeah. So there's one lawsuit that I'm aware of. It's in the Central District of California, I believe. It was filed by the unions, and then they added a amendment to the complaint addressing this 5 things email. I've actually been following the 5 things email like really carefully because I'm interested in it for more political sciencey reasons than I am like legal reasons. My sense is the following, though. Um, so every agency is required to have a performance management system. And that performance management system is managed by the agency, not OPM. And that's really important because the way an agency is structured is it's very chain of command oriented. Individuals have supervisors, they report to their supervisors, they don't report to OPM. That is a lot of the reason we're seeing a lot of confusion is most of these employees have never heard from OPM before, and suddenly they're receiving all these emails. And they're like, I don't know what I'm supposed to do with this. This looks like spam. So, you know, there's a set of laws that governs what can be done with that performance data and how it has to be collected on individuals. It's not clear to me that feeding that data to an LLM is legal. I don't wholly know that it's not. It's fairly clear to me that a supervisor could instruct their employees to apply to this email. It's also clear to me that, I mean, Musk made the threat that, like, if you don't respond, we're going to treat it as a resignation. That's definitely not lawful, because any resignation has to be voluntary and initiated by the employee, not OPM. So, I am unconvinced that a court would accept, well, we ran all these 5 bullet points through a LLM and it told us who to fire as anything other than arbitrary and capricious. But I guess we'll find out if that's what they do. I've heard like Musk himself has said he's not doing that. I don't really trust anything he says, but so I don't know if they're actually going to go forward with doing that. If they do, I think they hit a bunch of legal hurdles right away.
One complexity here, Nick, and I don't know if you or anyone else wants to respond to this, is where does Doge end and agencies begin? Because it feels like Doge has employees in multiple agencies. In some cases, the same employees are also employees of multiple federal agencies. And if you look across what used to be the US Digital Service, which is now the US DOGE service, but also GSA, but also several agencies that have data, you are seeing reports of these DOGE employees effectively being deputized as agency employees. And so in some respects, there's an individual who's in that agency who may be formally described as an employee, but the reality is this is, a 23-year-old coder who came on board with the Doge team. And that makes it much more difficult to maintain these sort of clear lines of hierarchy.
And that's such a great point, Don, because it started out that there was this Doge thing, which turned out to be Musk having dinner with Trump, and then from there went to a small handful of people to an online ad saying if you want to work for the government and do great things and work on possible hours, sign up here. That then led to the recruitment of a collection of people who were essentially Musk loyalists who were first dispatched to take over the Office of Personnel Management, then the General Services Administration, and then out to some of the departments like Treasury to get control over some of the financial data systems. But then now every agency has got Doge people who are embedded. Some of the people who were Dogers are now being translated, as you pointed out, into regular government employees. And so as regular government employees, instead of being whatever it is that they were before, whether they were people who were spies, who were there sitting there as quality control assistants, whether they were people who were management consultants, they now are in the chain of command and have authority to be able to make some of these decisions. So that what they've done is to turn Doge into from whatever it was, which was never really quite clear, into an organization that's designed to implant people into the formal governmental hierarchy so they're in a position to be able to make decisions. And that's something that is more than just a legal distinction and all this stuff. It has to do fundamentally with the way in which they're going to be able to exercise power.
And I'm not wrong in thinking we haven't seen anything like Doge in American administrative history. That this sort of small body that has such cross-government power, access to data. I mean, in theory, OMB plays sort of this role on the management front, but OMB doesn't. I don't feel like has ever exercised the scale of power that we're seeing Doge operate with.
The only thing remotely like this, uh, in recent memory at least, was the Partnership for Reinventing Government, and that organized a collection of people who were then detailed out to the agencies. But there were detailees from the agencies who came to work for the NPR. And then the NPR sent acolytes out to try to proselytize in the agencies. But this was, first of all, a collection of people who were uh, almost exclusively government employees to begin with. They were working within a system where the basic motto was that we had good people trapped in bad systems, so that it was a kind of liberation theology of turning them loose to try to do the things that they knew needed to be done. And by trying to change the culture of agencies to make things work better, there was not a massive recruitment of getting people in from the outside to fan out through the agencies. We had the Grace Commission during the Reagan administration, which was an effort to try to study the operation of the federal government and make recommendations for reform. But these were people as part of a regular federal advisory commission who visited agencies, came up with recommendations, but that were not part of the same system in the way that the Doge is. I frankly can't recall anything throughout the entire course of American history quite like Doge.
Loren, let me ask you a question before you respond.
Yeah.
So someone else also asked about Russ Vaught's role. So now he is the head of OMB again. He was in the first Trump term, and centrally involved in planning a second Trump administration and his relationship with Doge, because to some degree, he had his own plans for the administrative state, and now Doge is also on stage. To what degree is there actual alignment there between OMB and Doge?
Yeah. So for a technical as part of a technical explanation, the US Digital Service prior Doge is part of OMB or was part of OMB. By practice, by practice, to some degree by policy, but certainly by practice, a lot of what USDS has always done has been somewhat independent. Not so that they can go off and do whatever they want to, but it wasn't as though you had directive meetings based on exclusively what the OMB director wanted. And that would be what USDS did. USDS had its own sort of intake process in terms of like setting priorities and otherwise. It wasn't a fully independent organization, but they were allowed to operate with some modicum of independence there. So by practice, like they have that culture coming in. A lot of the individuals who were once part of USDS are no longer there. I think there's been quite a few who have come in. Some of them are still within the USDS structure, but now DOGE. So technically, if the Russ vote wanted to, he could call in Amy Gleason, whoever's supposed to be in charge of DOGE right now, and say, these are your new priorities. This is how I want you to effectuate. And I want you can only do things if you first have it reported to me. That would be a very typical OMB move to say, come and chat with us first, come brief the budget offices first before you make big changes here. Because that does not appear to be happening in this instance right now. Whether or not they actually will end up doing it, I think depends very much on how the president views their relationship versus how they are structurally and administratively aligned. I will say from a legal perspective, I would pay attention to how DOGE is claiming that it is funded. Is it funded by agency reimbursement to employees? Is it funded by the EOP and OMB budget? Is it funded by other appropriations? Because a lot of that matters in terms of like the kind of behaviors that they have, their authorities, and whether or not they can take some of the actions that they have so far. So definitely keep paying attention there, more to follow.
Let me ask, we're starting to run towards the end of time here, so I'm going to group a couple of questions here and let you pick which one you want to respond to. We had a couple of questions from students, one doing an MPA, thinking about should she finish her degree, another who's in the PhD job market soon and asking how should PhD students think about the job market in the coming year or two. So that is one question about our students who are part of APPAM as well. Another question gets to what's going to happen to contractors. And just as there are lots of students who are part of APPAM, a lot of people who are part of APPAM are contractors. They work in think tanks, they work providing advice to government, and they're similarly seeing cuts to funding via grants. And so any sort of insight or advice to either contractors or students here?
A couple points, if I might. I know that there's lots of concern that things are pretty bleak out there, but let me say a couple things. One is that at some point they're going to have to stop bulldozing, and they're going to start trying to figure out what is it going to do with what's left. You can't keep cutting Social Security all day long and then forget about the fact that you've got to deliver checks to people like me every month. And so at some point, they're going to have to try to figure out how to think about the capacity of government. There is, in addition to that, the enormous opportunity at the state and local level, to the point that some state and local governments are advertising to feds that if you're fed up with what you're seeing, just come and work for us, because there are opportunities, which there are. In addition to that, there are enormous new lines of work that I think are opening up. There's the question of what should we do about AI? What should we do about information technology? What you don't want to have to do is to worry about fixing some of the computer systems and the IRS or Social Security by going and visiting people in the nursing homes who are the only people who know how the programming actually worked. And so we've got ourselves in a position where there's enormous amount of updating and improvements that need to be done. There are enormous amounts of opportunities in thinking about the way in which we can identify improper payments in government, which is a place where it makes sense to think about using AI and how we might set things up to be able to do that. And I know that the people, even the Government Accountability Office, is super interested in that kind of thing. You can think about the ways in which the relationship of government with its contractors might change, and about how the lines of responsibility and authority ought to be. We can think about how we even talk about results for government. And here I don't mean to measure outputs or outcomes, but how it is that government can best talk to ordinary citizens about the kind of services that they're getting, so that the role so that government's operations are focused far more effectively on making sure that it's that relationship on results as opposed to outputs or outcomes is what drives what it is that's going on. Huge opportunities, I think hugely exciting opportunities. So this is a time, I think, to think big and to think long. If you're in the market right now, what would I say? What I'd say first is for PhD students, I'd emphasize the importance of context, that you can bring an understanding of context of what's going on so that both fellow faculty members, but especially students that you might be teaching, are aware and can think through some of these big issues. I know there are lots of universities developing undergraduate programs that are struggling trying to figure out how to do that. Boy, what an opportunity that is to be able to figure out how to teach. And then for students who are in the market right now or talking about finishing the degree, by all means, heaven knows. I mean, those of us who are of a certain age are counting on you figuring all this stuff out for us so that we can. I mean, I plan on someday figuring out how to retire, and if you guys are not out there doing this stuff, I'm going to be in big trouble. So please finish your degree so you can figure this stuff out. But then think about how it is that you can connect with the problems that there are out there and what kind of skills that you can bring to help people solve them. And one of the things that in particular I think is important that that the generation of students who are graduating can bring is a sense of figuring out how to not only work through social media, but how to connect with people across organizational boundaries, which is increasingly where the action is at. So I'll get off my soapbox for a second, but boy, what an incredible set of opportunities there are if only we have the sense to be able to grab them.
Let me, so you mentioned evidence and results here, Don. So let me throw this open to everyone here. So one of the questions that was raised in the chat is about the Evidence Act. So we have this piece of legislation passed during the first Trump administration, if I remember correctly, that basically says, government, you need to take evidence more seriously. You need to have a learning agenda. Decision making needs to be evidence driven. We also have the Government Performance and Results Act Modernization Act, which generates a lot of performance data. And so there is an infrastructure that exists that tries to push the government towards using evidence and using results. And so what are the prospects for this performance infrastructure and the evidence infrastructure? Are they going to be taken seriously? Or are they, just going to be background noise while the administration does what it wants?
So I'll jump in quickly on this, and then I could talk about this for a lot longer. In addition to the work that I did at OMB, the evidence team reported to me, so I was very privileged to work with them. So unfortunately, a lot of the key artifacts of the Evidence Act, like learning agendas at agencies, have been removed from websites in addition to evaluation plans and evaluation policies. I don't know if that was just part of like the wholesale scrubbing of websites or if that was a policy choice, and I think that remains to be seen. I think there's a few different angles that we could think of as either opportunities or ways to help support the evidence agenda from the outside. Opportunities, I think that if we ever get to a point where we're having a rational conversation about government efficiency and operations, like this could be one of the toolkits that we help try to push within federal agencies, whether that be as advocating for them as is, or going to Congress to say, they're saying that this is intended to be more efficient results and better outcomes. You need to be asking these questions, and here's where this lives. Here's how to find that. I think another opportunity, and this is a little cynical, is that Elon Musk is going out and saying publicly, hey, we're going to make mistakes sometimes. I messed up and I corrected, and here's how I did this. Part of having an evaluation evidence mindset is the ability to do that out loud and publicly. I can't believe I'm recommending Elon Musk as a model here, but federal leaders really struggle with doing exactly that. It could be an interesting time period to encourage a more experimental mindset amongst the federal government. I think there's some risk in encouraging that in this way, but having run against many, many barriers in this, I think it would be an interesting opportunity. The last thing is anything we can do on the outside to do basically external learning agendas to support federal evidence priorities from external sources is going to be incredibly valuable. There's no reason you have to wait for the Department of Labor to put out their learning agenda. There can be communities of academics to say, let's hold hold a webinar where we brainstorm and come up with what would that look like from our perspective ideally, and just put it out from an external perspective so that work and that ecosystem and that conversation doesn't go away. I have a lot of other thoughts on this that I've been brainstorming on, so happy to follow up with others if they want to chat further.
And let me just add to that, I'm reading here from the memo that came out yesterday from OMB and OPM, and there are two things that are in there that, if we're clever, could be used to try to orient the conversation more profitably. The requirement is that for agencies, data-driven plans ensured the new career appointment hires in the highest need areas. Well, I mean, that's a demand for evidence. And then in addition to that, there is a call for an explanation of how the plans will improve services for Americans and advance the president's policy priorities. So there is underlying all of this a call for more evidence, and the question is how it is that you're going to be able to make that happen and to be able to use that evidence to connect with ordinary Americans. And there's stuff there, and it's not clear that once you get done having all the fun with your chainsaw, that a chainsaw is going to help you be able to do that. So I think there's a connection between the Evidence Act and what it is that they're calling for that is there to be made.
You can certainly cut things down with a chainsaw, but that's not very good a tool when you want to build something.
Right.
Yeah. In the time we have left, we haven't mentioned Congress yet. So we've talked about the executive branch a lot. We've talked a little bit about the courts. What about Congress? What would be your message to Congress when it comes to stepping in at this moment? And there is a DOJ subcommittee. There are existing government oversight committees. So there are actors who have legal authority to at least monitor what is going on. And certainly many of their authorities, including spending authorities, are being contested by the administration. What should Congress be up to in the particular domains that we care about?
So I can say a couple things, mostly because members of Congress keep calling me and asking what they should be doing. So, point one I make often is make sure you figure out how this is going to affect your constituents, and you think very, very carefully about what happens if you don't respond early, because there are a lot of constituencies that rely heavily on federal employment. And the economy of those constituencies is very tied up in those federal workers having jobs. So it will spill over not to just the person in the Forest Service who loses their job, but to the bars they go to the restaurants they go to the grocery stores they go to. So you're looking at a very, very large economic impact, and you want to make sure you buffer it. It's fine if we want to find ways to cut government and cut fraud and waste and whatever, but do so in a way that doesn't tank the economy, because you want to win re-election. Two, I do think, and this is kind of towards Don's, undying centrism, there are reforms that Congress could pass that I think would be bipartisan. Federal hiring takes a very, very long time right now. And there are a lot of ways that could be improved. Now, whether, Congress has the appetite to do so, I don't know, but I'll continue to tell them they can do that. And third, Congress should be using its investigative power a lot more than it is. It is unfortunate that I talk to members of Congress and I am the first person telling them about things, by virtue of the fact that I get messages from civil servants on Signal just being like, hey, here's what's going on in my agency. And so I relay this to members of Congress and they're like, we had no idea. And I'm like, but you could have known. You have the tools to know. And so I think, a lot of what needs to happen right now is there needs to be a lot more transparency about what's going on. And Congress plays a very significant role in providing that transparency.
The 2 points here. One is that all of what Nick said, I think, makes enormous sense. And there are opportunities, I think, for being able to try to feed the conversation in more productive ways, but also how to help members of Congress from driving their trucks into problems that are going to end up just causing huge problems for them and their districts. There's some things that you can point to about whether it's a VA hospital closing down or people having a hard time getting their refunds out of the IRS. And so the things that we could help them understand that really help them where it is that they live and what is it they really care about. But on the other hand, I'm not very hopeful. I'm a huge optimist about most things, but not about Congress finding a way to be able to pull itself back around. So I think that it's the degree to which we could help, and that's great. But I think that our main energy ought to be focused on trying to help steer the administrative side of the street.
We are at time, so let me invite you one more time, if you weren't here at the beginning, to take a look at the next APPAM seminar on these issues, which is going to be about data at the federal government level. This is going, sorry. Um, that's another reporter. This is going to be a discussion of something we all care about, which is data, because we care about research, and what's going to happen to the data infrastructure that the federal government has built. But please also thank you all for coming. We had, I think, something close to 150 at one point. I know everyone is sort of scrambling for answers here, and it's good just to share notes. Please continue the conversation. I hope APPAM continues to be a place, either at our national meetings or on websites, webinars like this, where we can maintain this dialogue. Take care, everyone. Take care of yourself. Take care of the people around you. It is good to see you all. Thank you, Nick, Don, and Loren. Goodbye.